That sharp, echoing slap, followed by half a glass of Cabernet Sauvignon, splashed right across my face, sent a chilling shudder through the multi-million-dollar private tasting room here in Napa Valley. My daughter-in-law, Chloe, a high society art consultant who moves through San Francisco social circles, like a fish in water, didn't just want my blessing for this wedding. She wanted the deed to my oceanfront estate on the cliffs of Carmel by the Sea, completely unconditional and transferred to her name. When I said no, she didn't just throw her drink in my face, she hit me, hard, right in front of a crowd of Silicon Valley elites and tech investors. I didn't yell, I didn't strike back, I didn't even grab a napkin to wipe the red wine dripping from my chin onto my custom tuxedo. I just turned around calmly, walked out of that massive glass dome pavilion, headed to my car, and made a single phone call. 20 minutes later, when the heavy oak doors of the venue swung open again, it wasn't just the California Highway Patrol walking in. Next to them was a woman our family circle hadn't seen in years. The moment the guests realized who she was, all the color drained from their faces, and the real, desperate sobbing began. But to understand why I had to tear down my only son's wedding with my own hands, just to defend my dignity, you have to know exactly what happened 5 minutes before that slap. My name is Arthur Sterling. Most people just call me Arthur. I'm 68 years old, and I spent my entire life building the very backbone of Silicon Valley. I built the first commercial data centers back in the 90s, and I laid the foundational cloud networks that today's trillion-dollar tech giants rely on. For the past 30 years, I've run a top-tier venture capital firm, but through it all, I always believed my most successful investment was the family I built. I was standing near the open bar at the edge of the pavilion, holding a glass of vintage champagne. This winery, Meadowood Reserve in Napa, doesn't open its doors to just anyone. Above me, a kinetic chandelier, woven from hundreds of fiber optic cables and Swarovski crystals pulsed with light. A Grammy-winning jazz quartet was playing a smooth, expensive melody in the background. The white roses alone, flown in all the way from Ecuador, cost me $60,000. When all was said and done, I had written a check for nearly $500,000 to make this night flawless. $500,000 for just 6 hours of celebration. But I did it for Julian. He's my only son. My late wife, Clara, wanted nothing more than for him to have the absolute best of everything. She passed away from an illness 3 years ago, and since then, Julian has been my entire world. I watched him out on the center of the dance floor, spinning his new bride, Chloe. She looked stunning, I had to admit, and the haute couture wedding dress she was wearing was another thing I paid for on my black card. But as the song faded out, she didn't stay by her husband's side to enjoy the moment. She adjusted her dress, scanned the room, and walked straight toward me. There was no gratitude in her eyes, none of the joy you'd expect from a bride. Her gaze was locked on me, sharp and intense, like a red-tailed hawk spotting its prey in the tech jungles of Silicon Valley. As she stepped closer, I smiled. I thought she was coming over to thank me, maybe give me a hug, or tell me how much she wished Clara could have been here tonight. I was fully prepared to play the role of the proud, loving father-in-law. She leaned in close, bringing with her a heavy mix of high-end perfume and alcohol. She whispered into my ear, but her voice was cold as ice. She told me to sign the deed transfer papers for the Carmel estate right now, because her parents and her art team were moving in tonight. I blinked, wondering if the jazz music was just too loud and I had misheard her. I asked her to repeat herself. She sighed and rolled her eyes, treating me like a child who was slow to understand. She said her parents hated the suite I booked for them at the St. Regis. She complained that the mattress was too stiff, the room was too small, and it completely lacked that old-money California vibe. She told me they were sleeping at the Cliffside Estate in Carmel tonight, and that her art foundation needed that address for its headquarters. She demanded I sign the paperwork immediately. A cold knot formed in my stomach. That Cliffside Estate right off Carmel Beach wasn't just a piece of real estate, it was my home. It was where Clara and I had lived for 30 years. It was filled with her marine life specimens, her paintings, and the clothes she left behind in the closet that I still haven't had the heart to pack away. I still spend half my time there. It's my sanctuary. I looked at Chloe, forcing my voice to stay steady. I reminded her that it was my home and that I had already paid in full for the presidential suite at the best five-star hotel in San Francisco for her parents. I even offered them a private helicopter shuttle. She moved even closer, crowding my personal space, her long manicured nails practically dug into the sleeve of my tuxedo. She hissed under her breath, telling me that the hotel was old and stuffy. She said they wanted the infinity pool and the cliffside ocean views facing the Pacific. Then she told me that, honestly, I barely even stay there anymore. She said it was ridiculous for a guy pushing 70 to hog a 6,000 square foot luxury mansion, and told me to just hand over the title. She said Julian promised me she could have it. My blood ran cold. Julian promised. My own son, without even asking me, had used my home, the final piece of his mother's memory, as a bargaining chip to please his bride. I looked across the room at Julian. He was over with his groomsmen, laughing and talking, completely oblivious to what was happening. Or maybe he was just actively avoiding my gaze. I stood up straight. For 40 years, I've gone toe-to-toe with the most ruthless short sellers on Wall Street and gone rounds with federal regulators. I wasn't about to be blackmailed by a 29-year-old social climber who built her entire life on a curated social media image. I told her no, it wasn't happening. I said my wife's personal belongings were still there and that it wasn't a weekend resort for her parents, let alone an asset for her shell foundation. Chloe's face contorted. The beautiful bridal mask fell off completely, leaving nothing but pure, unadulterated venom. She raised her voice, not caring at all who heard her. She snapped, telling me to get over it, because Clara had been dead for 3 whole years. She asked why I was hoarding a dead woman's junk, like a pack rat, calling me a selfish, isolated old man who just couldn't let go of his power. The sheer disrespect stole the air right out of my lungs. It felt like a physical punch to the gut. The way she talked about Clara, the gentlest marine biologist you could ever meet, as if she were just a pile of non-recyclable trash, cut deep. I could feel my hands starting to shake. I reached out, trying to gently brush her hand off my arm because I needed some space. I told her never to speak about my wife that way again, and that she had absolutely no right. And that's exactly when it happened. First, she forcefully threw her half-empty glass of red wine right into my face. The deep red liquid poured down my forehead, stinging my eyes and staining my crisp white shirt. Immediately after, her hand flew up. The sound shattered the air in that open tasting room. It cut right through the rhythm of the jazz music like a gunshot, causing conversations at the nearby tables to instantly drop. My cheek erupted in a fierce, stinging burn, right there in the middle of the most luxurious venue in Napa Valley in front of absolutely everyone. She slapped me. The music cut out. The noise vanished. 150 heads turned in unison to look at us. The silence was heavy enough to suffocate you. I just stood there, wine dripping onto the expensive Persian rug, my hand pressed against my stinging cheek, looking at the woman my son had just sworn to spend the rest of his life with. Her chest was heaving, her eyes full of wild entitlement and rage. She didn't look sorry at all. She just looked furious that I had dared to defy her. I looked around for Julian. I saw him running over from the other side of the dance floor. For one tiny fraction of a second, a piece of me held out hope. I thought he would be furious. I thought he would defend his father. I thought he would step up and be the man I raised him to be. Julian rushed over and grabbed Chloe by the shoulders, but his eyes were locked on me. His expression was weak, pleading. He lowered his voice, asking why I had to go and provoke her. He told me I knew how stressed she had been planning the wedding, bringing up her anxiety, and asked why I couldn't just sign the stupid property deed. He begged me not to ruin his wedding. My heart broke. No, it didn't just break. It shattered into absolute dust. My own son, who had just watched his wife attack me and throw wine in my face, was blaming me. He wanted me to surrender my home and my dignity just to keep up his pathetic illusion of peace. I looked at Julian and then at Chloe, who was now fixing her hair, glaring at me with the smug look of a winner. In that exact moment, I realized that in a room packed with 150 people, I was completely alone. Despite all the money I had poured out, and despite all the love I had given this boy for 30 years, to them, I was just a roadblock. I was a wallet to draw cash from, a resource to be used up and thrown away. I didn't scream. I didn't swing back. I didn't cause a scene. Instead, I just very gently set my untouched glass of champagne down on the nearest high-top table. The crisp clink of the glass meeting the marble top was the only sound left in the entire room. I gave Julian one last look. I wanted that look to be the nightmare that haunts him for the rest of his life. Then I turned my back on them. I walked straight through the dead silence of the crowd. I could feel every single eye burning into my back. I could hear the murmurs starting among the socialites, the venture capitalists, and the tech bros. But I didn't stop. I walked out of the pavilion, down the grand stone steps, and straight into the chilly Northern California night. The valet pulled up in my car, a 1968 Ford Mustang. I'd restored myself. I got into the driver's seat, my cheeks still throbbing, the sour smell of red wine heavy in my nose. I pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a cold, hard fury expanding in my chest. I dialed a number I hadn't called in 3 years. It rang once, twice. A woman answered. Her voice was sharp, professional, and carried a dangerous, quiet edge. She told me it was Saturday night and said I'd better have a company-ending reason for calling. I took a deep breath. I told her to initiate Directive Alpha Zero immediately. There was a brief silence on the other end. Then she told me she was bringing the liquidation team and that they'd be there in 40 minutes. I hung up and looked out the windshield at the glowing floor-to-ceiling windows of the winery. They were still in there celebrating. They thought this weak old man had just taken his hurt feelings and gone home to cry. They thought they won. They had no idea I had just pulled the pin on a massive bomb, and that I was about to walk right back in and drop it directly in the center of their expensive wedding cake. The party was over. The war had just begun. The swelling on my cheek was still throbbing, a burning pulse that kept reminding me of the humiliation I'd just endured. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the sheer despair of watching my son run after me. As I walked toward the parking lot, Julian's voice came chasing after me. He pushed past the shocked guests, his face flushed and his eyes wide. For a split second, I actually thought he'd come to his senses. I thought he was going to take his wife by the hand and demand answers, standing up for the father who had just written a $500,000 check to give him this fairy tale night. But when he reached the steps, he didn't even look at the clear handprint on my face or my ruined tuxedo. He just stood there with his hands on his hips, his eyes showing zero anger, only complete and utter annoyance with me. He hissed under his breath, his voice trembling with frustration, asking me what my problem was and why I always had to be so difficult. I froze, the air completely leaving my lungs. I repeated the word back to him, my voice barely a whisper, asking him if he seriously thought I was being difficult. I reminded him that she had just hit me and thrown wine in my face, all because I wouldn't hand over my home and his mother's laboratory. Julian rolled his eyes, a gesture so dismissive it felt like a second slap to my face. He snapped that she was under too much stress, and that today was her wedding. He brought up how anxious she'd been for months trying to lock down picky art investors, and asked why I had to go and trigger her. He asked why I couldn't just say yes, sign the paperwork, and let the night go smoothly. I threw the word back at him, asking if he thought I was triggering her. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. I reminded him that I booked them the best presidential suite in San Francisco, drained my budget for this high-end reception, and all I wanted was to sleep in my own bed and protect his mother's memory. Julian suddenly raised his voice, loud enough to catch the attention of a few Silicon Valley executives smoking near the entrance, who eagerly turned to watch the billionaire family drama unfold. He shouted at me to drop the act about my wife's memory, calling the house just a building full of useless junk specimens. Then he told me that honestly, it was a waste of resources for me to live alone in a mansion that size. He let slip that he and Chloe had already talked about it, claiming it wasn't safe for me to live out there by myself. He told me that with my current mental state, I belonged in an assisted living facility in Palo Alto. The entire world seemed to stop spinning. An assisted living facility, a nursing home. The words hung there in the cold California night air, heavy and freezing. That was their plan. That was the future they discussed when they thought I wasn't listening. They didn't just want the keys tonight, or the deed to the house. They wanted to cast me aside. They wanted to store me away in some facility, like an obsolete server, so they could completely take over my estate and my venture capital firm. I looked at my son. I really looked at him. I saw the custom Brioni tuxedo I bought him. I saw the $100,000 Patek Philippe watch on his wrist, a graduation gift I gave him when he finished business school. I thought back to just last week, sitting in my office signing the check for this wedding. I remembered him sitting across from me, smiling, telling me how grateful he was for everything and that he would always take care of me. He had told me I was the best dad in the world and promised they would never let me feel lonely. It was all a lie. Every smile, every thank you, every single hug. It was just a cheap performance to keep the bank accounts flowing. Standing there, he didn't see a father. He just saw a roadblock. He saw a stubborn old man who was dying too slowly and standing in the way of his inheritance. I spoke up, my voice shaking from a mix of rage and grief, calling him by his full name, Julian Sterling. I told him I raised him better than this, asking if this was how he repaid me for giving him everything, by siding with the woman who assaulted me and telling me I should be locked away in a home. In Julian's face turned an ugly shade of purple. He yelled at me to stop throwing my money in his face, claiming I did it all the time. He shouted that I thought I could control them and own them just because I signed the checks. He told me they were adults and said that if I wanted to be a part of this family, I needed to make sacrifices. He ordered me to sign the deed, go inside and apologize to Chloe, and stop ruining his wedding. Then he gave me an ultimatum: get on board, or I was out. He was threatening me. If I didn't let them rob me blind, he was going to disown me. I looked past his shoulder and saw Chloe standing inside the glass doors. Her anger was completely gone. She was watching me with a smug, victorious grin, her eyes cold and hard. She knew she had won. She had turned my own flesh and blood into the sharpest weapon against me. Suddenly, a strange and powerful clarity washed over me. All the confusion vanished. All the hope died. The father who would have given everything for his son died right there in that luxury Napa Valley parking lot. I told him I understood perfectly. It wasn't a raging shout, just a quiet statement of fact. Julian frowned, clearly confused by my sudden calmness, and asked what exactly I understood. He demanded to know where the paperwork was and told me to hand it over. I didn't answer him. I never looked at him again. I turned around and walked toward my old Mustang. I walked away from the son I had cherished since the day he was born. I started moving away from the luxury lights, away from the loud music, and away from the life I had believed in so deeply. Julian's voice chased me from behind, shifting from desperate to annoyed, shouting that if I walked out those gates today, I shouldn't bother coming back. He yelled that until I came back on my knees with the signed deed and an apology, I shouldn't show my face again. I opened the car door and got inside. The moment the door slammed shut, all the noise was cut off. The quiet of the cabin wrapped around me. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, my hands tightly gripping the vintage steering wheel, staring out at the pitch-black vineyards ahead. I touched my cheek. It was still burning, but I wasn't sad anymore. I was completely done being sad. A cold, hard resolve was settling deep in my gut. Timon wanted my house. They wanted my assets. They wanted to erase me. I sat quietly in the dark, the engine off, but the heat from my rage was more than enough to keep me sharp. Diane was on her way. My liquidation team was assembling. But waiting 40 minutes was an eternity for a betrayed Silicon Valley tycoon. In the world of high finance, 40 minutes is enough time to bring down a commercial empire. And tonight, 40 minutes was plenty of time for me to figure out exactly how this pack of parasites had been eating away at mine. I reached over to the passenger seat and pulled my laptop out of its leather briefcase. It was a military grade encrypted machine that looked completely ordinary from the outside. Julian used to mock it, saying that as a partner in a top venture capital firm, I should be using a thinner, sleeker tablet. He had no idea that this machine held the root encryption keys to our entire firm. When I gave Julian the title of managing partner at Sterling Capital, along with the massive corner office and all the public-facing roles, I never, absolutely never, handed over the super administrator root access to the firm's servers and capital pools. I was the architect of this company's digital infrastructure, just like back when I built those massive data centers. I left a backdoor that only I knew about, a God mode that allowed me to view everything, access everything, and overrule everyone. I opened the laptop, the blue light of the screen blinking in the dark cabin. I plugged in the encrypted hardware key that hung around my neck. The login prompt flashed at me. User, founder_0. I typed in my password, a 48-character random string I'd memorized years ago. Access granted. I wasn't here to look at startup pitch decks or quarterly earnings reports. I was here to track the money. Specifically, I was tracking the flow of funds from the unlimited black card I gave Julian 3 years ago. It was supposed to be used for business development and necessary high-end networking. I set incredibly loose restrictions on it because I assumed my son had enough common sense to use it responsibly. I pulled up the real-time transaction logs, the screen instantly filling with data codes as a waterfall of expenditures poured down. I quickly skimmed past the lavish spending I already expected. Dinners at 3 Michelin-star restaurants in San Francisco, custom Tom Ford suits, and private yacht rentals for weekend trips to Lake Tahoe. Those were just the annoying habits of a spoiled rich kid, but they weren't illegal. It was just the cost of packaging him to play the part of a successful venture capitalist. But then a highly hidden anomalous pattern caught my eye. I noticed recurring massive wire transfers to an entity labeled Aura Art Advisory. On the surface, it looked legitimate. Chloe called herself an art consultant after all, so maybe Julian was buying decorative art for the office, or making cultural investments. But the fluctuations in the amounts were incredibly bizarre. It was $50,000 one week, $120,000 the next, and then suddenly $200,000 on a random Tuesday. I clicked on the vendor details, and the system pulled up the business registration address and tax ID. My heart hit heavily against my ribs. That address wasn't for some luxury high-rise in Manhattan or downtown San Francisco. It was a rundown neighborhood in the San Fernando Valley, right outside Los Angeles. I recognized it instantly. Last Christmas, I had my assistant mail a holiday card to that exact spot. It was the home of Chloe's parents, Robert and Linda Dubois. I kept digging, pulling up the electronic invoices tied to those massive payments. The listed services were a complete joke. Strategic spiritual guidance, feng shui and spatial energy realignment, and high-end lifestyle curation. Aura Art Advisory was a complete ghost. It was a shell company, a sham setup designed for the sole purpose of laundering money out of my firm's accounts and funneling it straight into my in-laws' pockets. In the last 6 months alone, Julian had transferred nearly $1 million to them. $1 million. That wasn't just some generous allowance. It was a staggering, unearned annual salary. He was using the firm's accounts to turn his father and mother-in-law into secret executives at Sterling Capital. He was bankrolling their lavish lifestyles, buying them yachts, luxury watches, and covering their failed investments. Everything, right down to this very wedding tonight, was on my dime. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. This wasn't just a moral failure. It was outright tax fraud. It was embezzlement and money laundering. If the IRS decided to audit us, they wouldn't just slap the firm with astronomical fines. They'd look at me, the primary source of the capital, as an active co-conspirator. But I wasn't done yet. I kept scrolling. I uncovered a series of transactions from last month heading straight into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, totaling $8 million. The transaction code was cleverly disguised as an early stage liquidity injection for Web 3.0. I used my own technical overrides to trace that wallet address. It wasn't a blockchain startup at all. It was a liquidation pool for a high leverage crypto loan, a desperate move to cover a massive margin call. Hunter, Chloe's deadbeat older brother, the guy who called himself a crypto prodigy. He had used insane leverage to gamble on worthless altcoins, completely blew up his account, and ended up in crippling debt. And Julian had actually dipped into the venture firm's capital pool, money belonging to me and the institutional limited partners who trusted me, to bail his brother in law out of a bottomless black hole. He had embezzled money from one of the top venture funds in Silicon Valley to pay off an offshore debt for a gambler. I slammed my fist against the steering wheel. The sheer stupidity of it was mind boggling. The arrogance had blinded him completely. Julian thought he was invisible. He thought that because he was the CEO's son, the accounting department wouldn't look too closely at complex crypto spreadsheets. He forgot that while accounting reported to him, the audit committee reported directly to me. But the worst discovery was still waiting for me. I logged out of the financial network and accessed the highest security legal folder on our servers. This was where Julian kept his personal contracts, thinking they were perfectly safe behind the company firewall. I found a document created just 3 days ago. The file title read, Post-Marital Asset Carve-Out and Debt Acknowledgement Agreement. I opened it. It hadn't been drafted by our firm's legal team. It was drawn up by a ruthless, bottom-feeding boutique law firm in Los Angeles. It was a legally binding promissory note. The document read, I, Julian Sterling, hereby acknowledge a personal debt to Chloe Dubois in the amount of $25 million as compensation for strategic consulting and emotional support provided during the course of the relationship. I stared at the screen, my eyes burning. $25 million for emotional support? I scrolled down to the fine print at the bottom. It contained a specialized poison pill clause. In the event of a dissolution of marriage, or if the husband's assets are frozen by a trust, this debt shall hold absolute priority over all other claims, overriding any prenuptial agreements or family trust restrictions. This debt is fully secured by all assets of the signee, including future inheritance rights, corporate equity, and real estate. I saw right through the game. It was a beautifully calculated legal heist. Julian knew the family trust was ironclad. He knew that if he and Chloe ever divorced, or if I got angry and cut off his funds, Chloe wouldn't get a single dime from the trust because everything was in my name. So together, they fabricated a massive, fake debt. If they ever divorced, or if I tried to fire him, he could claim he owed her $25 million. They could use the courts to legally liquidate my assets to pay off this sham debt, completely bypassing the trust's protections and laundering my money directly to her name, tax-free. From a twisted criminal standpoint, it was brilliant, and it was ironclad proof of a conspiracy. This wasn't just Chloe pulling the strings. Julian had signed it. His digital signature was right there, time-stamped 48 hours ago. He was actively plotting with his wife to defraud his own father and the entire family legacy. He wasn't a victim blinded by love. He was a co-conspirator. A strange sensation washed through my chest. It wasn't pain anymore. It felt like a massive weight being lifted off my shoulders. For years, I had spent so much time worrying about Julian. I worried he wasn't smart enough or tough enough. I worried that when I died, the wolves of Silicon Valley would tear him apart. I was wrong. Julian was the wolf. He was the one trying to eat me alive. I closed the file and dragged the entire folder onto my encrypted desktop. I made a secure backup and sent it to my secondary server in Switzerland. Then I forwarded a copy straight to Diane's private email with a subject line that read, Smoking Gun. I was entirely done protecting him. The evidence I had right now wouldn't just disinherit him, and it wouldn't just get him fired on the spot. It was enough to bring federal charges down on his head: wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. Right then, my iPad on the passenger seat lit up with a push notification. It was a live security alert from the smart home system at my cliffside estate in Carmel. I tapped the app, and the moment the video feed loaded, I gasped, coughing from the sheer shock of it. The Carmel estate was supposed to be dark and empty, but right now the cameras showed the entire oceanfront living room flooded with light. With a shaking finger, I zoomed in on the screen. There were people inside my house. Not masked burglars, but something far worse: the Dubois family. Chloe's parents, Robert and Linda, and that parasite brother, Hunter. I stared at the screen, trying to understand how they even got inside. The estate was locked down with biometric retina scans and rolling security codes. Only me, the estate manager, and Julian had access. It was clear as day. My wonderful son hadn't just badgered me for the deed at his wedding. He had given away the security overrides to his new in-laws before they even cut the cake. I watched in horror as Robert Dubois, a man who had declared bankruptcy twice, and whose tuxedo for this wedding was paid for with my credit card reward points, stood at my custom walnut bar. He was holding a bottle. Even on the small screen, I recognized the label. It was a 1982 Macallan single malt. Clara and I bought that bottle together during a trip to Scotland, saving it for a golden wedding anniversary she would never live to see. Robert didn't have a clue how to open a bottle like that. He was using a heavy kitchen knife, brutally hacking away at the wax seal. The cork shattered, spilling the priceless gold liquid all over my handmade Persian rug. He didn't care at all. He raised the bottle straight to his mouth, took a massive swig, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and laughed as he said something to his wife. I switched the camera feed to the primary suite, my sanctuary, the bedroom where I held Clara's hand as she took her very last breath. Linda Dubois was in there. She had opened up the walk-in closet, my wife's closet, a sacred space I kept exactly the way she left it, where the fabric still held a faint trace of her scent. Linda was ripping Clara's silk blouses off their hangers, tossing them onto the floor like discount rags. Then I watched her pull out a sapphire necklace and a white Arctic mink coat. I bought that coat for Clara's 60th birthday. She barely wore it, treating it like a priceless treasure. Linda Dubois shoved her arms into it. The coat was far too tight, but she forced herself into it anyway, spinning around in front of the full-length mirror, posing in the most sickening way. I turned up the volume on the iPad. The security microphone picked up her voice with crystal clarity. She shouted out toward the living room, telling Bob to look at her, bragging that she looked like a Hollywood queen. Then she asked if he could believe that old hag kept something this gorgeous locked away in a closet. She stroked the fur, staring greedily at herself in the mirror, before letting out a loud, cackling laugh. She snapped that, honestly, it was a blessing the woman died when she did, because now someone with actual taste could finally enjoy it. She called Clara a waste of resources. It was a blessing she died when she did. Those words echoed inside my small car cabin. Tears suddenly stung my eyes. They weren't tears of sadness, but a pure, unadulterated fire of rage. She was wearing my late wife's clothes, standing in my late wife's bedroom, celebrating her death just to play a vain game of dress-up. I switched the camera feed again. I needed to see where Hunter was. The deadbeat with a criminal record for gambling and theft was currently in my private study. He wasn't admiring the night views of the Pacific Ocean outside the window. He was hunkered down behind my mahogany desk. He had slid a valuable painting off the north wall, exposing the biometric safe built into the drywall. Hunter was sweating profusely, the reflection visible even under the night vision mode. In his hands he held an angle grinder and a heavy sledgehammer, gear he had clearly dug out from my garage toolbox. He was trying to use brute force to smash through the safe's digital keypad. There was $100,000 in emergency cash inside that safe. But more importantly, it held the antique pocket watch my late father left me, a family heirloom I always planned to pass down to Julian whenever he had his first child. Hunter cursed, swinging the hammer wildly, yelling at the piece of junk to open up. The heavy thuds echoed through the feed. I watched the three of them. The father was destroying my memories, the mother was desecrating my grief, and the son was stealing my legacy. They were like a swarm of locusts. My own son had invited them into my house, and before my bones were even cold, they were already tearing everything apart. They thought I was just a walking ATM, a weak, confused old man they could manipulate however they wanted. I hit the record button on my laptop screen. A red dot began blinking in the corner. I recorded Robert spilling the whiskey. I recorded Linda throwing around insults about Clara. I recorded Hunter violently hammering away at the safe. I needed every single second of it. This wasn't just to make me completely give up on him. This was ammunition. This was the heavy artillery I was going to use to blow their entire lives to pieces. The grief I felt back in the pavilion was completely gone now. It had burned to ash. In its place was a cold, metallic, unbreakable resolve. I was no longer a father. I was no longer a grieving widower. I was a Silicon Valley titan watching his territory get trampled on, and I knew exactly what I had to do. I stopped the recording and saved the files to the cloud. Then I forwarded copies directly to the police and to my personal encrypted email. I wasn't taking any chances. I took one last look at the screen. Linda was now rummaging through Clara's jewelry box on the vanity. She lifted a strand of pearls, weighing it in her hand. I whispered to the empty car, telling Linda to enjoy her little fashion show while it lasted, because she was about to pay a price she couldn't possibly afford. I closed the iPad and threw it onto the passenger seat. I checked my watch. Diane was 10 minutes away. 10 minutes until the hammer of justice dropped. Right then, my phone started buzzing in my hand. The caller ID read Julian. Of course it was him. He'd probably wanted to see if I'd come to my senses. He probably expected me to crawl back like a good, obedient little dad with the signed paperwork in hand. I stared at the phone, looking at the picture flashing on the screen. It was a photo from his Stanford graduation. We were both smiling, and my arm was wrapped around his shoulder. He looked so proud, so full of potential. I didn't answer. I let it ring. I wasn't ready to listen to his voice yet. If I spoke to him right now, I might lose my temper and blow my cover. I needed him to be surprised. I needed him to be blindsided at the absolute highest point of his arrogance. The ringing stopped, and then a text message popped up. It read, "Dad, stop throwing a temper tantrum. Answer the phone. We need to talk about the deed transfer for the Carmel house. Also, Chloe demands that you come back and apologize to her in front of everyone. This is non-negotiable." A temper tantrum? I let out a short, dry laugh in the dark. He thought this was just an old man throwing a fit. He thought this was a business negotiation. He had no idea that while he was texting me, his in-laws were committing felonies in my living room. He had no idea he had just handed me the perfect weapon to cut him out of my life completely. I looked back at the winery. The lights were still bright, and the party was still going, but the countdown had already started. When the clock struck midnight, Julian Sterling's pumpkin carriage was going to turn into a mountain of debt. I tapped my fingers on the steering wheel, waiting for those black SUVs to appear. My anger had settled into a razor-sharp focus. I was ready. Bring on the liquidation team. Bring on the feds. Let's see if Chloe still thinks the ocean view is beautiful when she's being dragged out of my cliffside estate in handcuffs. The phone vibrated again, an aggressive, continuous buzz demanding my attention. Still Julian. The photo was still that graduation picture, but while it brought back nostalgia 5 minutes ago, now it just made me sick to my stomach. I debated whether to pick it up. The fatherly part of me, the weak part, wanted to ignore it, drive away and let the lawyers handle the massacre. But the other part, the venture capitalist who had eaten competitors alive at the negotiation table, knew I had to hear what he had to say. I needed to hear the worst of it from his own mouth, so that when I cut this blood tie, there wouldn't be a single shred of regret. I slid the screen and put the phone to my ear. I didn't say hello. I didn't say a single word. I just listened. The background noise was incredibly loud, the heavy bass from the DJ mixing with the peak commotion of the party. But Julian's voice cut right through it. drunk, slurring, and dripping with a disgusting amount of entitlement. He barked into the phone, asking where the hell I was, claiming he'd been looking everywhere for me. He complained that the partners and the investors were asking questions, accusing me of embarrassing him again. I looked down at the iPad on the passenger seat, where the silent video feed showed his brother in law cutting into my safe with an angle grinder. I finally spoke up, my voice terrifyingly calm, asking him if he thought I was embarrassing him. I told him it was funny he said that, because right now I was watching his in laws ransack my house like a bunch of street thugs. He didn't even pause. He wasn't surprised, and he didn't deny it. He just let out a massive, incredibly impatient sigh. He slurred that I was making a huge deal out of nothing, claiming he told them they could stay there to get comfortable. He snapped that it wasn't a big deal, but walking out on Chloe in front of everyone was. He yelled that she was in the bathroom crying her makeup off, all because of me. I reminded him that she threw a drink at me and slapped me across the face, even though I knew it was pointless. He shouted back that it was because she was stressed out. I could practically hear the spit hitting the microphone. He screamed that I was always pushing people, but said he was done playing. The good son game. He told me he wasn't asking anymore, ordering me to turn my car around right this second. He demanded I come back, get down on my knees in front of everyone to apologize to his wife, hand over the Carmel deed, and beg for her forgiveness. I gripped the phone tighter, throwing a question back at him. I asked him what he would do if I didn't. The line went quiet for a moment, nothing but heavy breathing on the other end. Then his voice dropped. It wasn't the sloppy anger of a drunk anymore. It was a cold, well-rehearsed threat. He told me that if I didn't, he would call Dr. Evans first thing in the morning. He said he would report my recent episodes, claiming I was becoming forgetful, incredibly aggressive, and completely unfit to manage myself. I frowned. My episodes? I didn't have any episodes. My mind was sharper than it had ever been. Julian's words slid out like snake venom as he threatened to file for adult guardianship. He admitted he'd already talked to a lawyer, claiming they could easily prove I was mentally incompetent. He brought up that I was pushing 70, acting erratically and hoarding assets, saying the court would grant him full power of attorney. He bragged that once he had that, I wouldn't have a single say in any of my money or houses. My blood turned completely to ice. This wasn't a threat made in the heat of the moment. He had already spoken to lawyers. He had planned the whole thing. He was ready to use the legal system, the very system I taught him to respect, to legally strip away my rights as a human being. I asked him quietly, my voice barely a whisper, what his plan was next. I asked if he was going to lock me up. He actually sounded proud of his efficiency, telling me they already found a place called Evergreen Care Center. He claimed the price was reasonable and the facilities were fine, saying I'd be safe there because they had strong restraint policies. He told me I'd never have to stress about the Carmel house or the venture fund ever again, because they would take over the burden for me. Evergreen Care Center. I knew that place. It was a state-funded facility on the edge of San Jose. It was a dumping ground where the forgotten went to die, a place where the hallways permanently smelled of bleach and absolute despair. I asked him what they were going to do with the Carmel estate. He was completely blunt about it, saying they were going to sell it because they needed the cash. He let slip that Hunter owed some dangerous people a massive amount of money, about $8 million in bridge loans. He said if Hunter didn't pay it back by Monday, those people would end his life, claiming Chloe was terrified, and they had to liquidate assets to cover the family debt. There it was, the naked truth. They weren't just greedy, they were backed into a corner. The deadbeat brother-in-law was drowning in gambling debts, and to save Hunter from the consequences of his own actions, Julian was fully prepared to sacrifice his own father. He planned to declare me insane, lock me away in a cheap asylum, and sell off my life's work to pay off a criminal's debt. And he was casually telling me this entire plan on his wedding night. I rested my head against the headrest and closed my eyes. An unbelievable deep exhaustion washed over me, but it wasn't physical. It was the heavy weight of reality crashing down. I had caused this. I had built this monster myself. I thought back to when Julian was just a little boy. When he broke the neighbor's window with a baseball, I immediately wrote a check and apologized for him, ensuring he never had to face the scolding. When he failed his high school math class, I paid top dollar for private tutors to do his assignments so he wouldn't face the embarrassment of summer school. When he totaled his first Porsche, I bought him a safer McLaren the very next week because I couldn't bear the thought of him taking the commuter train with everyone else. I smoothed out every single road for him. I cushioned every single fall with the thickest safety net money could buy. I taught him that consequences were things that happened to ordinary people, but the Sterling family had a permanent pass. I thought I was being a good father. I thought I was giving him the perfect life I never had growing up. But I was wrong. I hadn't raised a man. I had raised a parasite. I had raised a weak, spineless coward who would rather destroy the father who fed him than stand on his own 2 feet. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was a reckoning. I was harvesting the exact bitter crop I had spent 30 years planting. But the harvest season ended right now. Every single drop of grief evaporated instantly, leaving nothing but a cold, hard finality. I opened my eyes and took one last look at that glittering winery. I stared at the lights glowing through the windows, imagining Julian standing there in his tuxedo with the phone pressed to his ear, fully believing he held all the cards. He thought he was a king sitting high on a throne. He thought I was just a pawn he could sacrifice whenever he pleased. He had absolutely no idea that the executioner had arrived on the battlefield, and I was carrying a sledgehammer big enough to shatter his entire world to pieces. Julian's voice grew impatient over the line, snapping at me, asking if I was still listening and if I actually understood what he was saying. He ordered me to get my ass back inside and clean up this mess, threatening that if I didn't, I'd be eating cheap jello in a 6-person shared room at Evergreen by Monday morning. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. Diane was less than a minute away. The police were already on their way to the Carmel estate. The trap was completely closed. I sat up straight, straightened the cuffs of my wine-stained shirt, and cleared my throat. I told him I heard him loud and clear, keeping my voice incredibly steady. It was the exact tone I used in the boardroom when I fired partners who tried to gang up and overthrow me. It was the voice of the founder. He completely mistook my calmness for surrender, sighing with relief and saying it was about time I used my head. He asked if I was walking back in. I looked in the rearview mirror, checking my reflection. I didn't look like a confused, incompetent old man at all. I looked exactly like Arthur Sterling. I told him straight out that I wasn't coming back inside to apologize. He snapped back, demanding to know what exactly I thought I was doing then. I told him I was waiting. He barked back, asking what the hell I was waiting for. I told him I was waiting for his tuition because he was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his entire life. He warned me one last time to stop playing riddles with him. I cut him off. I didn't yell and I didn't curse. I spoke with the absolute authority of a judge reading a death sentence, telling him to go ahead and enjoy the party. I told him to drink all the Lafite he wanted, eat the $5,000 cake, and dance with his wife, because this was the absolute last celebration he would ever be invited to for the rest of his life. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I could still hear him screaming on the other end, his voice sounding tiny, faint, and desperate coming out of the small speaker, begging me not to hang up on him. I pressed the red end call button. The line went dead. Complete silence filled the cabin once again, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It was heavy with the suffocating pressure of a bomb waiting to detonate. I shoved the phone back into my pocket and locked my eyes on the entrance of the winery. Right then, the matrix headlights of 3 black Tesla Model X's sliced through the darkness of the parking lot. They rolled in together in a sleek, dark, and incredibly menacing convoy formation. Diane was here. I pushed open the door of the Mustang and stepped out onto the freezing asphalt. I buttoned up my suit jacket and took a deep breath of the crisp, cold California night air. I wasn't a victim. I wasn't a terrified old man. I was the storm that was about to make landfall. The 3 black Teslas pulled up in a flawless formation, completely ignoring the valet attendants and making zero effort to find an actual parking spot. They drove straight into the VIP drop-off lane, aggressively blocking the entrance and forcing a line of rideshare cars and a stretched Lincoln Town car to honk and reverse out of the way. But the moment the blinding high beams of the lead vehicle flashed in the Lincoln driver's face, he wisely chose to shut up. This wasn't a social visit, this was an armed invasion. The gull-wing doors of the Teslas rose up in unison. 6 men stepped out from the back 2 vehicles. They were massive, dressed in tight black tactical suits with communication earpieces fitted in their ears, their eyes carrying that distinct, cold look unique to former Navy SEALs or Mossad agents scanning for threats. These weren't the polite security guards hired by the winery. These were private military contractors Diane kept on permanent retainer, specifically used for handling the heavy, physical liquidation of assets involving hundreds of billions of dollars in Silicon Valley. They fanned out instantly, establishing a hard security perimeter around the lead vehicle. The lavish, celebratory vibe of the winery vanished, dropping down to absolute freezing point in seconds. The rear door of the lead Tesla swung open. A pair of black, red-bottomed stilettos hit the asphalt with a sharp, decisive click. Diane Vance stepped out of the car. She looked exactly the way I remembered her, absolutely flawless and deeply terrifying. She was wearing a sharply tailored charcoal gray power suit. Her silver hair was pulled back so tightly into a flawless bun, it looked like it was straining her nerves. In one hand, she carried a heavy black leather briefcase, and in the other, she held an encrypted tablet. She didn't glance at the stunned valet boys, nor did she look at the heavily dressed guests walking by. Her eyes scanned the parking lot like radar, locking onto me instantly. Behind her, 4 more people stepped out of the vehicle. I recognized all of them. There was Marcus, our firm's chief litigator, Sarah, the forensic accountant who could track a single penny through a multi-billion-dollar crypto mixing pool, and 2 junior associates who looked absolutely terrified by the scale of the situation, but were still tightly clutching boxes of legal files. This was my wartime cabinet. I walked toward them. My legs felt a bit stiff, but my spine was completely straight. As I got closer, Diane's sharp, hawk-like eyes caught the clear red handprint burning on my cheek and the glaring red wine stains covering my shirt. Her jaw clenched tight. She spoke up, her voice low and completely devoid of any cheap sympathy, telling me I looked like hell. It was exactly what I needed. Sympathy would have only made me feel weak, but her cold assessment made me feel deadly. I told her I felt like I had just woken up from a 30-year coma. She nodded, accepting the answer without a word. Instead of offering a comforting hug, she handed the heavy leather briefcase straight to me. It felt massive and solid in my hands, exactly like holding a loaded Glock. She tapped the leather cover with her long, perfectly manicured fingers, telling me everything was inside. She explained that she had gotten an emergency court injunction, waking up federal Judge Harrison in the middle of the night. She said he was furious at first, but the moment she sent over the blockchain tracking data showing Julian forging signatures and embezzling venture funds to cover offshore debts, the judge electronically signed the paperwork right there in his living room while wearing his pajamas. She paused, her tone turning ice cold, as she explained that the document granted me immediate, absolute dictatorial control back over the Sterling Family Trust and the venture fund. She said it gave us the full legal authority to freeze every single one of their accounts, seize every vehicle, and immediately evict anyone illegally occupying my properties. I took the briefcase and asked about the police. Diane told me that the FBI's white-collar crime division and local SWAT had already entered the Carmel estate. She said her insider confirmed they were executing arrest warrants for wire fraud, embezzlement, and felony destruction of private property. She promised we'd have a live feed soon, but said our primary target right now was the ballroom. I looked past her toward the sparkling, revolving glass doors of the winery. I could hear the muffled, heavy bass of the music thumping from inside. I could see them in my head. Julian was probably raising a glass for a toast right now, trying to mask the panic clawing at his throat, while Chloe was likely playing with her trailing wedding dress, believing she was the newly crowned queen of Silicon Valley. They were throwing around money they didn't own, enjoying a life they didn't deserve, completely certain that I would eventually bend the knee. They had no idea that Grim Reaper was already standing on the doorstep. Diane looked at me and asked if I was ready, warning me that once we pushed through those doors, there was no turning back. She made it clear that I wasn't just crashing a party. I was about to walk into a room of 150 of the most powerful people in Silicon Valley and personally put my own son on the chopping block. She said it was going to be incredibly brutal, completely public, and that he would never forgive me. I thought back to that phone call. I thought about Julian threatening to lock me away in a state asylum. I thought about him using my money to cover gambling debts while mocking my sanity. I thought about the sting of that slap and the wine dripping down my face. I told her smoothly that he had made his choice, choosing greed and turning his back on his father. Now, I said, he was going to see exactly what happens when the capital fights back. Diane nodded, a terrifying smirk creeping onto the corners of her mouth as she said it was time to go clean out the trash. I adjusted my ruined tuxedo and took a deep breath. I wanted them to see exactly what kind of monster they had underestimated. Diane turned to the security team. She ordered them to lock down every single exit, stating that no one was permitted to leave until every company-issued black card and asset was recovered. She told the former Navy SEAL captain to restrain the groom if he tried to cause a scene, but made it clear they weren't to initiate physical violence unless he did. The captain gave a low, disciplined nod. She then turned to the legal team, instructing the four of them to flank us on both sides, with the subpoenas and asset freeze orders ready. She told them that if anyone, and she meant anyone, tried to interfere, they were to read the court injunction immediately. She demanded the operation be executed with surgical precision. I stepped up next to her. We stood side by side, a solid wall of black suits that looked completely out of place against the warm, soft lighting of the winery. I felt a sudden surge of adrenaline, a dark, absolute sense of power rushing back into my veins, a feeling I hadn't experienced since the day I stepped back from the front lines. I was no longer the retired gentle father. I was the architect of Sterling Capital. I was the godfather of Silicon Valley. We moved forward. The valet boys scrambled backward out of our way. The security guards at the door took one look at the expression on Diane's face and the towering Terminator-like figures behind us, and wisely abandoned any idea of checking our invitations. They respectfully pulled open the heavy glass doors for us. We stepped into the luxurious reception lounge, where the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and truffles. The noise from the party grew louder with every step. We marched across the marble floors in perfect unison, our footsteps sounding like a steady war drum. The guests in the lobby stopped talking, staring at us in absolute shock, instinctively sensing the aura of complete destruction radiating off our group. We didn't slow down. We walked straight toward the massive double oak doors of the grand ballroom. Through the walls, I could hear the DJ's voice booming over the sound system, asking the ladies and gentlemen to put their hands together and welcome back the stars of the night, Mr. and Mrs. Julian and Chloe Sterling. Inside, the room erupted into a deafening roar of cheers and applause. I walked up to the edge of the doors. I didn't bother knocking like a polite guest. I just gave a sharp nod to the two largest security guards flanking me. They stepped up, grabbed the heavy brass handles, and slammed both doors wide open. The massive oak panels crashed into the walls with a deafening thud that vibrated through the floorboards like a crack of thunder. The cheers died instantly. 150 heads whipped around in perfect unison, and there we stood. I wasn't some broken old man crawling back to beg for forgiveness. I was the leader of an execution squad, and we were here to carry out the sentence. I took the first step into the ballroom, with Diane right on my right flank and my security team fanning out behind me in a tight military formation. The light from the Swarovski crystal chandeliers hit us instantly, throwing long, imposing shadows across the wooden dance floor. I locked eyes with Julian from across the massive, field-sized room. He was standing there with a microphone in one hand and a fresh glass of champagne in the other, the fake practice smile freezing solid on his face. The music didn't cut out right away, but the energy in the room was instantly sucked dry. It was the kind of dead silence you only get in the wild when an apex predator steps into a clearing and every single prey animal stops breathing. I marched onto the inlaid wooden floor. The liquidation was officially underway. The heavy impact of those oak doors hitting the drywall sent a physical shudder through the room. But for a split second, the sheer momentum of the party tried to keep rolling forward. Up on the massive projector screens, a highly produced slideshow of their love story was still flashing. Waiters carrying silver platters piled high with Wagyu beef and caviar were still weaving between tables. And under the glare of the expensive spotlights, Chloe was still holding her microphone, basking in the attention of the crowd. She obviously hadn't noticed us walk in yet. She laughed, her diamond necklace catching the light as she tilted her head back. She brought the microphone back to her lips, speaking in a loud, performative voice that carried a heavy layer of contempt across the room. She told the crowd not to worry about Arthur, claiming I was just getting a little tired. She chuckled into the mic, telling the guests that when people get to my age, their minds start slipping and they lose control of their emotions. She told everyone I'd probably just gone home to take my pills and sleep, laughing it off and saying the night belonged to them anyway. A low wave of chuckles rippled through the tables. It wasn't entirely malicious laughter, mostly just that polite, social giggling people do to appease the hosts and smooth over an awkward situation. But Julian laughed louder than anyone else in the room. He stood right next to her, nodding like a bobblehead, co-signing her malice. He was actively letting his new wife tell the entire elite tech community of Silicon Valley that his father was a senile old fool, all to justify why I had walked out. He was trading my remaining dignity for a few cheap laughs from strangers. Then the drummer in the jazz quartet spotted us. His hands froze mid-swing, the sticks dropping as the rhythm of the music completely fell apart into a messy clutter of noise before dying out entirely. The pianist looked up, caught sight of the 6 massive, stone-faced security details behind me, and yanked his hands off the keys as if the ivory had turned to white-hot iron. The music was dead. The only sound left in the massive space was the low hum of the air conditioning and the awkward echo of Chloe's last sentence floating over the crowd. Chloe frowned, tapping the microphone a couple of times, complaining about the music cutting out just when they were getting into the groove. She followed the collective gaze of the room and finally turned her head around. 150 faces, representing the most powerful minds in Silicon Valley, turned together to watch the disaster that had just walked through the door. I stood at the edge of the floor, the deep red wine stains on my white shirt looking exactly like dried blood. But the sheer presence of the crew behind me ensured nobody dared to stare too long at the mess. I took a step forward, the soles of my leather shoes clicking sharply against the wood. Diane walked in perfect step beside me, the leather briefcase in her grip looking less like an accessory and more like a guillotine blade ready to drop. Silence, a heavy, suffocating silence. As I walked, my eyes scanned the tables. This wasn't just a family gathering. It was a high-stakes networking event. Half the people sitting here were business associates, managing partners from rival venture firms, tech founders I'd bankrolled, and even a couple of state senators who handled tech regulations. These were people who understood the brutal reality of capital markets. I watched the exact moment the realization hit their faces. Over at table 4, a senior partner from Sequoia Capital froze, his fork slipping from his fingers and clattering loudly against his porcelain plate. His eyes widened, darting back and forth between me and the woman walking by my side. He leaned over to his wife, whispering in a frantic breath that carried clearly across the quiet room, pointing out that Diane Vance had just walked in. That whisper spread through the ballroom like wildfire. The names started jumping from table to table. Diane Vance, the Grim Reaper of Sand Hill Road. People were asking why the chief legal officer of Sterling Capital was crashing a wedding with private security. They knew this wasn't for a toast. It was a hostile takeover. I saw the color drain from the faces of several tech founders who had faced Diane across a negotiation table before. They knew better than anyone that Diane Vance didn't do social calls. She didn't attend weddings, and she didn't show up for birthday parties. If Diane Vance walked into a room with a full legal team and armed contractors, it meant someone was about to lose everything they owned, and they were likely heading to federal prison. The guests stopped eating. They set their glasses down. People instinctively began shuffling their chairs back, trying to put physical distance between themselves and the main stage, desperate to avoid getting caught in the blast radius. Julian finally registered what was happening. He was standing right at the edge of the stage, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his mouth. He went rigid, looking from me to the security detail and then to Diane. For a split second, he looked exactly like a 6-year-old kid, caught red-handed doing something terrible. But almost immediately, the arrogance I had spent 30 years fueling took over again. He slammed his champagne glass onto the nearest table, snapping the delicate crystal stem in half. He jumped down from the stage, his face twisting with pure fury as he marched straight toward us, with his suit jacket flapping open. He screamed at me, his voice cracking under the weight of his rage, demanding to know what the hell I thought I was doing. He gestured wildly at the men behind me, shouting about me bringing thugs to his wedding, asking if I had actually lost my mind. He lunged forward, his fists clenched tight. I knew he wouldn't actually hit me. He was just trying to get into my face, attempting to use his size to intimidate me the same way he did over the phone. He was desperate to maintain his pathetic image of authority in front of his new wife and his wealthy friends. But he never even got close. I didn't move an inch. I didn't step back, and I didn't even blink. 2 of my security details slid forward like ghosts. Their movements were fluid, the result of thousands of hours of elite training, making Julian's aggressive charge look like a clumsy joke. They didn't strike him. They just instantly formed an immovable wall of muscle and Kevlar right in his path. Julian slammed directly into them, looking like he'd just run full speed into a solid concrete pillar. He let out a sharp grunt, staggering backward a few steps, clutching his chest as he gasped for air. He screamed at them to get out of his way, shouting that he was Julian Sterling, the CEO of the investment firm. The lead contractor, an ex-SEAL captain named Davis, with a prominent scar running across his brow, just looked down at Julian with zero emotion, telling him to step back and making it clear he wouldn't say it a second time. Julian yelled back, spit flying from his mouth as he refused to move. He ordered me to make my dogs back down, threatening to call the police and have all of us thrown in jail. I spoke up, my voice incredibly quiet, but carrying clearly through every corner of the dead silent ballroom. I told him he didn't need to bother calling the police, because they were currently very busy over at the Carmel house. Julian went completely rigid, as if he'd been hit by a taser. While he was still trying to process the terrifying weight of what that meant, Diane moved. She completely ignored Julian, not even giving him a passing glance. She walked right past the standoff, stepping through the stunned crowd of billionaires and heading straight for the stage. Her stilettos hit the wooden steps with a slow, deliberate rhythm that sounded like a countdown to doom. Chloe was still standing up there, clutching the microphone, her brain completely short-circuiting from the shock. She watched Diane approach, like a deer caught in the high beams of an 18-wheeler. She tried to say something, desperate to claw back her high society dignity, stuttering into the microphone to ask who Diane thought she was, reminding her that this was a private event and telling her to get off her stage. Diane didn't bother answering. She stepped right up to Chloe, offering no smile and no introduction. She simply reached out and smoothly took the microphone right out of Chloe's hand. It wasn't a violent yank. It was an absolute demonstration of power. Chloe's fingers just let go because when faced with the overwhelming presence of Diane Vance at close range, a 29-year-old gold digger simply had zero defense mechanisms left. Diane turned around to face the crowd, tapping the top of the microphone once with her finger. The heavy, dull thud boomed through the speakers, officially signaling the end of the party and the start of a public execution. She set the black leather briefcase down on the podium, dropping it right on top of the handwritten thank you speech Julian had prepared. She popped the metal latches open, the sharp click sounding cold and clinical in the quiet room. Her eyes swept across the sea of Silicon Valley elites, business partners, and family members. She waited. She held the silence until the absolute quiet was so heavy that the only sound left in the room was Julian's heavy, labored breathing as security held him at the bottom of the steps. Diane finally spoke, her voice calm, professional, and carrying a terrifying amount of authority. She apologized to the room for the interruption, introducing herself as Diane Vance, the chief legal officer for the Sterling Family Trust and the absolute executor for the Asset Management Committee at Sterling Capital. A collective, sharp intake of breath rattled through the executives in the crowd. Every single high-level professional in that room knew exactly what that title meant. The absolute executor only stepped in when a firm was facing a catastrophic crisis, or when the founder initiated an emergency liquidation protocol. Chloe finally found her voice again. She took a step forward, reaching out to grab the microphone back, desperate to save her crumbling fantasy. She shrieked that Diane couldn't stand there, screaming that it was her wedding and ordering her to get off the stage. Diane slowly turned her head, looking down at Chloe with such deep, unadulterated disdain that Chloe involuntarily took a half step back. Diane spoke with an icy tone that cut like a scalpel, calling her Miss Dubois, stating that it was more appropriate to use her real name now. She told her she was mistaken about one major detail, explaining that this had never been her stage. She revealed to the entire room that this luxury Napa Valley pavilion was rented using Sterling Capital's corporate accounts. She made it clear that the caviar, the imported roses, and even the custom designer gown on her back, every single molecule of this wedding was paid for by the man she had just thrown wine at, and whom her husband had threatened to lock away in an asylum. The color drained from Chloe's face instantly. She looked down at Julian in absolute panic, begging for help with her eyes, but Julian was pinned at the bottom of the steps by my security, looking like a snake that had just had its fangs ripped out. Diane turned back to the crowd, pulling a document out of the briefcase and holding it high enough for everyone to see. It was a legal filing stamped with the bright red seal of the United States Federal Court. She announced loudly that she was there to execute an emergency ex parte injunction issued by a federal judge. She explained that due to massive corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and malicious physical assault against the firm's founder, Arthur Sterling, they had initiated the highest level asset freeze and recovery protocol, Directive Alpha Zero, 5 minutes ago. She paused, letting the heavy weight of those criminal charges settle into the minds of everyone in the room. She stated clearly that as of right now, every single corporate credit card, personal trust account, and offshore fund tied to Julian Sterling and Chloe Dubois had been completely frozen. She added that the primary corporate account used to secure the winery had been deactivated, and all pending wire transfers had been clawed back by the bank. Then she turned her head, looking directly at the winery's general manager, who was standing near the kitchen doors looking like he was about to faint. Diane addressed him politely, but without a shred of mercy, informing him that the final check for $300,000 had just bounced. She told him the party was officially running on a deficit and suggested that unless Julian Sterling could produce a personal debit card with enough cleared funds right now, he should stop pouring the vintage champagne and tell the chef to turn off the stoves immediately. The entire room completely fell into absolute chaos. Waiters holding platters froze dead in their tracks. The general manager was barking frantically into his radio. Guests in their expensive designer suits and gowns began standing up, their sharp instincts telling them that the luxury cruise ship named the Sterling Inheritance hadn't just hit a reef, it was about to plunge straight to the bottom of the ocean. But Diane wasn't anywhere near finished. She stood on the stage, looking down from the podium at Julian, who was currently staring up at her with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. Her voice sliced through the commotion like a sharp scalpel, announcing that the party was officially terminated. She told them they had exactly 10 minutes to pack up their personal belongings and get out of there, warning them that if they were still on the winery property after 10 minutes, she would have the local sheriff arrest them for criminal trespass. Then she looked directly at Julian, telling him not to bother calling the firm's private car service because all the luxury vehicle contracts had been canceled. She told him that tonight he was going to have to find his own way home. The entire ballroom was already shaking from the weight of Diane's declarations, but this still wasn't the climax. She wasn't the kind of lawyer who relied on mere intimidation to get things done. She believed in evidence. She believed in the kind of bloody, undeniable proof that nails a person to a pillar of shame forever. Without saying another word, she turned to the audio-visual technician who was hiding behind the mixing console. She didn't need to threaten him. She simply pointed a single finger at the high-definition HDMI cable hanging down from the side of the podium, the one that had been set up to play romantic photos of the newlyweds. The technician looked like he'd just seen a ghost. With a trembling hand, he passed the cable right over to her. Diane plugged it straight into her military-grade tablet. Up on the stage behind us, the massive multi-million-dollar LED screen flickered. It had been designed to show beautiful cinematic footage of sunny California beaches, but tonight it was about to broadcast a full high-definition horror movie. The footage started out in black and white. It had a little bit of security grain, but the resolution was incredibly sharp. It was the high-definition surveillance video, pulled from the winery's private tasting room from just 45 minutes ago. The chaos in the room instantly died down, replaced once again by that heavy, suffocating silence. On the screen, 150 Silicon Valley elites saw me standing by the bar, holding my champagne. They watched Chloe approach me, her body language visibly aggressive. The footage didn't have audio, but the visuals told the entire story. They saw her finger digging into my chest, and they saw me stepping back, clearly trying to de-escalate the situation. And then the moment happened. On the 20-foot wide screen, the gesture looked infinitely more violent. First, she forcefully threw her half-glass of wine straight into my face, and immediately after, her arm loaded back and whipped forward with such speed it left a blur on the video feed. My head was violently snapped to the side. The sheer force of the impact was undeniable from the way my body instinctively reeled backward. A collective, massive gasp rattled through the crowd. It was the sound of 150 people realizing they had just been played for fools. Just a few minutes ago, Chloe had stood on that stage claiming I was drunk, crazy, and losing my mind. But the video was ironclad proof that a dignified elderly man had just been assaulted and humiliated by a woman in a wedding dress. I looked at the guests. Many of them had their hands over their mouths. They were looking back and forth between the screen and Chloe, with expressions of pure disgust. The mask of the refined, high society darling had been completely ripped away, exposing the arrogant, violent abuser underneath. Chloe stared up at the screen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She looked around frantically, trying to find a lie to tell, but in front of a 20-foot piece of undeniable evidence, any excuse was laughably useless. But Diane still wasn't stopping. She slid her finger across the tablet screen. The footage changed again. This time, it wasn't a still security feed. It was a full-color, wildly shaking first-person video. Across the bottom of the screen, bright red text flashed. FBI/California SWAT, live body cam feed. Along with the video, piercing audio exploded through the high-fidelity ballroom speakers. The sound of blaring sirens, static heavy police radios, and heavy tactical boots sprinting across hardwood floors filled the space. It was my house, my cliffside estate in Carmel. A massive team of FBI agents and SWAT officers in tactical vests were swarming into the living room. Right in the center of the frame, face down on my Persian rug, Robert Dubois, Chloe's father, was being pinned to the floor. A massive officer was wrenching his arms behind his back, slapping handcuffs onto his wrists. Robert, completely hammered on my priceless bottle of Macallan, was screaming incoherently, yelling about police brutality. The camera whipped sharply to the left, locking onto Linda Dubois. She was actually wearing my late wife's white Arctic mink coat. She was completely hysterical, clawing wildly at a female officer who was trying to restrain her. Her shrieks blasted through the ballroom speakers, deafeningly loud as she screamed for the officers to get their hands off her, shouting about her daughter becoming the owner of the house and the heir to the sterling fortune. The female officer yelled right back over the noise, telling her she was under arrest for grand larceny and felony destruction of property, swiftly using a takedown maneuver to spin Linda around and pin her flat against the wall, reminding her she had the right to remain silent. The lens shifted rapidly again, panning across the kicked-in doors of my private study. Inside, two agents were dragging Hunter out like a dead dog. Hunter was kicking and screaming frantically, one hand still desperately clawing at the edge of my half-destroyed safe as if it were a lifeline. A heavy-duty angle grinder was lying on the floor, still throwing off a few dying sparks. Hunter was howling like a slaughtered animal, screaming that it was his money and claiming the old man owed it to him because he needed it to clear his books. The screen displayed a scene of absolute chaos. It was a lightning-fast, devastating federal raid that completely crushed what was left of the Dubois family's vanity. The elites in the ballroom stared at the screen with a look of horrified fascination. They saw the top-shelf whiskey pooled on the rug. They saw my late wife's clothes scattered across the hallway like garbage. They saw that the in-laws who claimed to be high-end art investors were actually just a pack of rats, looting a house the moment the owner's back was turned. They weren't respectable people at all. They were criminals who broke into a man's safe while he was paying to feed them dinner. I looked over at Julian. He was staring up at that massive screen with his head tilted back. His face wasn't just pale anymore. It had turned a completely lifeless ashen gray. He looked exactly like a standing corpse that had just had its soul violently ripped out of its chest. He had to watch his mother-in-law get arrested wearing stolen goods. He had to watch his father-in-law get cuffed. He had to watch his deadbeat brother-in-law get pinned to the floor by federal agents. In that exact second, the full reality finally hit him. He knew I had uncovered everything. He knew I knew about the security codes, the offshore wire transfers, and the $25 million laundering agreement. The ultimate consequence of his weakness and greed was currently having its world premiere in ultra-high definition right in front of the most powerful people in California. His knees finally gave out. He collapsed heavily onto the edge of the stage, his hands gripping the wooden steps tightly just to keep himself from sliding flat onto the floor. Chloe let out a throat-tearing shriek. It wasn't a scream of fear. It was the pure narcissistic rage of a person whose mask had been violently ripped away. She screamed like a maniac, sprinting toward Diane on the stage, demanding she turn the damn thing off. She called Diane a bitch, screaming that she had ruined her wedding and destroyed everything. She hitched up the heavy train of her wedding dress, her hands clawing wildly at the air as she tried to force her way up the steps to get to Diane. But she never even touched the first step. Diane didn't even blink. Her eyes didn't even leave her tablet screen. She simply gave a slight jerk of her chin. The two brick wall security contractors instantly stepped into Chloe's path. They didn't strike her. They just stood there like two immovable mountains. Chloe slammed hard against them, pounding her fists frantically against their armor-plated chests, spitting out strings of profanity that would make a sailor blush. She looked past the guard's shoulders, locking her eyes onto me with a look that belonged to a demon, screaming that she hated me. She called me a selfish, vicious old man, screaming that the house belonged to her and that Julian had promised it to her. The live feed on the screen was still running. Linda Dubois was currently wailing as she was marched out the front gates, the expensive mink coat sliding off her shoulders to reveal the cheap, tacky dress underneath. I started moving. I walked right past Julian, who was slouched on the floor, too terrified to even lift his head to look at me. I walked up the steps onto the stage, stopping right next to Diane. I looked down from the platform at Chloe, who was currently throwing a tantrum on the floor, completely separated from us by the security team. Her makeup was entirely ruined, with black mascara running down her cheeks like two paths of mud. I reached out, picked up the microphone from the podium, and brought it to my lips. The entire room plunged into a dead silence once again, save for the faint sound of sirens coming through the speakers and Chloe's heavy, desperate gasping for air. I spoke to her, my voice incredibly calm. It was the tone of a man who held the absolute power, who had paid every single bill, and who had finally decided to cut off the funding permanently. She lifted her head, her bloodshot eyes full of pure hatred. I pointed a finger at the massive screen behind me, asking her if she remembered saying she wanted the keys and the deed to my estate. On the screen, an FBI agent was currently placing a federal seal across the front doors of my house. I told her the police were currently holding those keys, explaining that they were being logged as physical evidence for first-degree international wire fraud and grand larceny. I paused, letting the full weight of the statement crush whatever sanity she had left, telling her that if she wanted that deed, she could go try her luck at the federal holding facility in San Jose. I told her I was highly confident that once the feds were done processing her parents for burglary, the FBI agents would be thrilled to sit down with her in an interrogation room to discuss the legality of that $25 million emotional support fee. I let go of the microphone. Gravity took over, and the mic plummeted through the air, hitting the wooden stage with a heavy, amplified thud before a sharp, piercing screech of audio feedback blasted through the speakers. That loud, agonizing ring served as the perfect curtain call for their little show. I turned to Diane. She closed her leather briefcase with a sharp, decisive snap. Then she locked her tablet, and the massive LED screen instantly went black, plunging the entire ballroom right back into that dim, soft, pink lighting that now looked completely ridiculous. I looked at her and told her it was time to go. We stepped down from the platform. We walked right past Chloe, who was completely broken now, slumped in a heap of white lace and tulle, sobbing in total despair. We walked past Julian, who was still white-knuckling the edge of the stage, his eyes staring blankly at the empty screen as if his entire future had just gone up in smoke, right inside that black rectangle. We walked side by side through the silent crowd. The Silicon Valley tech titans, investors, and socialites parted for us like the Red Sea, terrified, creating a wide, open path for us to pass through. Nobody dared to say a word. Nobody dared to step in. Their brains were completely overloaded, trying to process the fact that they had just witnessed the most brutal, calculated, and devastating public execution in corporate history. I walked out of the ballroom and into the main lobby. I didn't look back. I didn't care what they whispered behind my back. I didn't care what the Wall Street Journal or the tech blogs would write about this scandal tomorrow morning. I had my dignity back. And as I stepped out into the crisp, clean California night air, I realized something even bigger. I had my life back. The silence that settled over the ballroom was heavy enough to crush bones. It was that suffocating stillness that only happens right before a Category 5 hurricane makes landfall. I stood near the exit of the lobby, looking back one last time at the wreckage I had just caused. For years I had played the part of the quiet bank account, signing checks in the background, cleaning up my son's messes, and using my money to fill every single hole in his competence. But tonight I had thrown the checkbook straight into the furnace. The ink was completely dry. I watched coldly as the absolute weight of reality crushed what was left of their minds. Chloe was the first to snap. She had been crumpled on the floor, but suddenly she let out a screech like a dying animal and lunged up from her messy white train. The arrogant pride she carried just minutes ago was completely gone, replaced by pure panic and hysteria. She stumbled forward and grabbed Julian by the lapels of his custom tuxedo as he lay paralyzed on the steps. She bunched the fabric into her fists, shaking him with a terrifying amount of strength, almost lifting him off the ground. Her voice turned incredibly sharp and desperate, making a few venture capitalists in the front row wince. She screamed right in his face, spit flying, calling him a liar. She shrieked that he told her he owned the firm, calling me a mascot, a clueless old man who didn't even understand financial statements and signed whatever paper was put in front of him. She demanded he do something to fix this mess, screaming at him to tell me he was lying. Julian looked like a deer frozen in the high beams of a semi-truck. He tried weakly to pry her hands off his collar, his eyes darting frantically around the room, begging for an escape route or an ally, but the only thing waiting for him was the cold, disgusted glares of 200 Silicon Valley elites who couldn't turn away fast enough. I just watched quietly. I didn't step in. I wanted him to feel the absolute crushing weight of his own lies collapsing on top of him. Julian's face turned a deep purple. He stuttered, trying to force out a laugh, that high-pitched, nervous chuckle that couldn't fool a single person in the room. He trembled, begging her to calm down, claiming I was just having another one of my episodes. He lied to her face, telling her I wasn't clear in the head, and insisting he ran everything as the CEO. He called it a systems glitch, a simple misunderstanding. I turned around to face them fully. I didn't have a microphone anymore, but in that dead silent room, my voice carried into every single corner. I told him there was no misunderstanding, keeping my voice heavy and even. I told him his only mistake was being stupid enough to think my patience and generosity were birthrights he could gamble away. I gestured to Diane, who stood like an avenging angel on my right. She stepped forward and handed me a heavy, deep blue leather folder. I opened it slowly, letting the crisp sound of the paper slicing through the silence echo across the room. I pulled out the first document. The edges were slightly yellowed. The original charter I signed 30 years ago when I built the family trust and the venture fund from scratch. I held it up, asking Julian if he recognized it. I let a trace of mockery slip into my tone, noting that of course he didn't, because he had never once bothered to read the dry legal paperwork. I told him he was too busy using my dividends to fund his fake tech billionaire persona. But I pointed to the very bottom of the primary equity agreement, revealing that the name listed under sole ownership wasn't Julian Sterling. It was mine. It had been mine for 30 years. Julian stopped fighting, his mouth hung open, his eyes going completely vacant. I told him plain and simple that he was never a partner, never a majority shareholder, and wasn't even a senior executive. I explained that in the eyes of the law and the board, he was just a salaried employee, an at-will employee I gave a fancy title to, just to feed his pathetic vanity. The color drained from Julian's face so fast I thought he might pass out right there on the steps. Chloe let go of his collar as if she'd been electrocuted, stepping back with a look of pure disgust and disbelief. But I wasn't done pulling the weed out by its roots. I flipped to the next page, ensuring there was absolutely zero gray area left. I locked my eyes onto my son, telling him that as an employee he was bound by a code of conduct. I told him to look closely at Section 4, Clause B, the Ethics and Absolute Loyalty Clause. I read it out loud, showing that any employee who acts maliciously against the owner, embezzles corporate funds, or misuses company resources for personal gain, faces immediate termination without severance, along with full civil and criminal liability. I paused. The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the faint rush of the air vents. I took a deep breath. Doing this didn't bring me joy. It felt like cutting away a piece of my own flesh. But just like a surgeon removing gangrene to save the body, it had to be done. I lowered my voice, letting it roll through the space like thunder, laying out exactly what he had done. I told him he used corporate accounts for a lavish wedding without authorization, embezzled LP money to cover his brother-in-law's crypto debts, and bought the 7-carat pink diamond on Chloe's finger with my company's funds. I told him he had broken every single fiduciary duty he owed to me and the firm. I told him that as the sole owner and ultimate authority of this firm, I was officially terminating his employment, effective immediately. I looked him dead in the eye and told him he was fired. Julian reeled back as if he'd been hit in the face with a hammer, repeating the word back to me in a trembling whisper, calling it impossible because he was my son. I slammed the folder shut with a loud snap. I told him that being my son was a privilege, not a get-out-of-jail-free card for corruption and incompetence. And I told him he had bled that privilege dry. Then it was Diane's turn. Ta adjusted her rimless glasses, looking down at her tablet with a face like winter ice. Her tone was pure, cold business as she addressed the ruined couple. She told Julien and Miss Dubois to listen closely because their situation was deteriorating at a rate of $100,000 a second. She tapped the screen. She informed them that the unlimited corporate black card in his wallet had been deactivated 10 minutes ago, his credit lines were zeroed out, and every authorized user card attached to Chloe had been blacklisted. She revealed that she had already notified every vendor in the room, the catering staff, the florists, and the venue management. She made it clear that Sterling Capital would not be paying a single dime for tonight, stating that if they wanted the reception to continue, they needed to provide an alternative payment method immediately. She gave a quick estimate, telling them the remaining balance for the night was between $150,000 to $170,000. I watched Chloe frantically rip open her Hermes Birkin bag, pulling out her phone and furiously refreshing her banking apps. Her face twisted into pure horror as she realized every single one of her accounts had been frozen solid. But Diane's ruthless inventory kept rolling right over them like a freight train. She looked up from her tablet, turning her attention to their living arrangements. She informed them that the penthouse duplex at the Millennium Tower in downtown San Francisco was a corporate asset reserved for active executives. Since his employment was terminated, his legal right to occupy the property was revoked. She revealed that her legal team had filed the eviction paperwork an hour ago, giving them exactly 24 hours to clear out their personal belongings. She warned them that tomorrow at noon, security would change the locks and revoke their access cards, stating that any property left behind would be thrown into a cheap storage locker at their own expense. Chloe let out a blood-curdling shriek, a sound caught between a desperate sob and pure rage. She screamed that they lived there, yelling that Diane couldn't just throw them onto the street, calling it their home. I cut her off ice cold, telling her it was never their home. I told her it was my property, a luxury I kindly allowed them to use, and said they had treated that blessing with the same contempt and malice they showed me. Diane cleared her throat sharply, pulling their focus right back to the chopping block. And finally, Diane said, extending her hand toward the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that looked out over the valet area, regarding that Porsche 911 GT3 RS parked out front, the one in the most prominent spot, with the huge custom ribbon tied across the hood, which was supposed to be the firm's wedding gift to you. It turns out that car is also a corporate lease. Since you're no longer an employee, that lease is terminated effective immediately. If you look out the window right now, you'll see our asset recovery team is incredibly efficient. Every single head in the grand ballroom whipped around to look outside. Through the clear glass, under the pale yellow glow of the parking lot lights, everyone could see a massive, heavy-duty, flatbed tow truck. An operator in coveralls was already hooking a thick, solid steel chain around the front axle of that gleaming silver Porsche. Julien lost his mind. He sprinted toward the window, slamming his hands flat against the glass, watching in pure, helpless desperation as his ultimate status symbol and proudest toy was ruthlessly hoisted into the air and secured onto the back of the flatbed. He looked exactly like a helpless child, watching someone steal his favorite toy. But in that room, there wasn't a single shred of sympathy left. There was only a cold, chilling curiosity as people watched the spectacle unfold. Julien spun back around, completely drenched in sweat, his eyes bulging from sheer panic. He broke down completely, his voice cracking as he begged me to stop. He told me I'd made my point and asked me to stop embarrassing him, pleading that we could talk it out. He promised to sign whatever paperwork I wanted if I would just tell them to put the car down and unfreeze the bank accounts. I looked at him. For the first time in my entire life, looking at my son brought absolutely zero emotion to my chest. The well of forgiveness had run completely dry. I told him quietly, with a voice entirely devoid of warmth, that I hadn't done this to him. I told him he had built this entire life himself, constructing a fantasy castle on a foundation of endless lies, greed, and the casual destruction of other people. I asked why he was surprised that it was finally collapsing under its own weight, making it clear I wasn't there to negotiate or debate. I was just there to notify him. But the final blow that truly broke Julian didn't come from me. It came from the woman he believed was his soulmate and co conspirator. It came from Chloe. She was standing entirely alone in the center of the dance floor, her chest heaving as her eyes darted frantically between the Porsche, disappearing into the night and the man she had just sworn to spend her life with. The cold calculation flashing in her eyes was terrifying to watch. Her brain was running the math at lightning speed, and the final equation came up to an absolute zero. She turned her gaze to Julian, and the mask of the blushing, affectionate bride ripped away entirely, exposing the raw, primal predator underneath. She didn't see a husband in trouble. She didn't see someone she loved. She just saw a terrible investment with a negative return. She saw a deadbeat with no job, no penthouse, no Porsche, and zero claim to a family trust. She suddenly realized she had just legally tied herself to a sinking ship that was heading straight for federal criminal charges. She hissed at him, her voice quiet but dripping with pure poison, causing the closest guest to take a step back. She called him a pathetic, worthless liar, screaming that he told her he had everything handled and that he had me wrapped around his finger. Julian begged her, stretching his hand out to grab her, pleading that they could fix it and sue me. She screamed at the top of her lungs, violently slapping his hand away, demanding he keep his filthy hands off her. She shrieked about what he was going to sue me with, mocking his maxed out, fake life. She yelled that he didn't have a single cent to his name and called him a glorified assistant, screaming that she had wasted 2 years of her youth, believing she had landed a billionaire Silicon Valley tycoon. She began frantically ripping at the ring on her left ring finger, the massive pink diamond I had stupidly paid for. The ring resisted, catching on her knuckle, but she viciously forced and wrenched it loose, completely indifferent to the scrapes, desperate to draw a line between herself and a bankrupt loser. With one final violent pull, the ring snapped off. She screamed hysterically that she didn't want his junk or him, vowing she would never be the wife of a bankrupt loser living in a cheap motel. She threw the ring with everything she had, channeling all her rage into it like a baseball pitcher. The seven-figure diamond ring struck Julian dead in the cheekbone, instantly leaving a bright red mark before bouncing onto the wooden floor. It made a sharp, seemingly endless metallic clinking sound as it rolled away into a dark corner. She shouted that she was completely done, aggressively grabbing the heavy train of her designer wedding dress. She kicked off her expensive Jimmy Choo heels, leaving them right where they fell. She screamed that she was going straight to court in the morning to file for an annulment, telling him never to contact her again because she was done with his crazy family. She turned and sprinted away, running past her stunned bridesmaids, past the tech investors who were too shocked to speak, and right past the $5,000 wedding cake. She burst through the double oak doors of the ballroom, her bare feet slamming hard against the marble floor. She was running away from a crime scene, escaping a mountain of debt, and abandoning the man she had promised to stand by through richer or poorer just moments ago. Clearly, the poor option was an absolute deal-breaker she wouldn't tolerate, for even 5 minutes. Julian stood completely alone in the center of the dance floor. The red mark on his cheekbone from the ring was already starting to swell. He stared blankly at the empty doorway where his wife had just vanished, then looked down at the dark corner where the ring had rolled, before slowly, painfully turning his eyes back to me. He looked incredibly small. He looked entirely shattered. He looked like a pathetic creature who had just woken up from a beautiful dream, only to realize he was standing in a hell of his own making. I stared back at him. My heart felt incredibly heavy from a grief that threatened to completely drown me, but my resolve remained harder than steel. His entire life, I had stepped in to save him from the consequences of his own choices. Tonight, out of love for him, I was choosing to let him hit the ground hard. I addressed the entire room, my voice exhausted but carrying the weight of a final judgment, apologizing to everyone again for the chaos. I announced that the wedding reception was officially over and told the guests to go home. I turned around and walked toward the exit, with Diane walking right beside me. I didn't look back at my son a single time. I stepped out into the crisp, dark Napa Valley night, leaving the wreckage behind me forever. I knew the most brutal execution was over, but my own long, lonely road to rebuilding was just beginning. The speed at which the crowd emptied out of the ballroom was fast enough to be insulting. Guests I had known for a decade or more, Silicon Valley partners, tech founders, distant relatives who always greeted me with massive smiles, were now rushing for the exits like rats fleeing a sinking ship. They kept their heads down, desperately avoiding eye contact, whispering frantically to each other behind their hands. Their only thought was to put as much distance as humanly possible between themselves and my son's catastrophic scandal. The expensive perfume and anticipation that filled the air earlier had vanished, replaced by the sour smell of spilled wine and a suffocating layer of humiliation. I stood near the edge of the lobby like a quiet island in the center of a storm, watching the backs of these people as they fled the scene. Julian was the only person in the entire room who hadn't moved toward the doors. He stayed frozen in place, staring at the empty doorway where his bride had disappeared, his brain completely overloaded and unable to handle the absolute speed of his fall from grace. Then he slowly turned his head and looked at me. The arrogance that had held his spine straight for the last 5 years had completely evaporated like mist under a hot sun. In its place was a raw, primitive terror that came from being stripped of all protection. He took a step toward me, then another. His legs shook so violently it looked like his bones had turned to water. He wasn't just walking, he collapsed entirely. He hit the hard marble floor with a heavy thud, dropping straight to his knees. He didn't even seem to register the sharp pain of his knees hitting the stone, or maybe he was just using that physical pain to distract himself from the tearing feeling inside his soul. He crawled the last few feet on his knees, reaching out with trembling hands to grab the bottom of my suit pants. He lifted his face up to look at me, completely covered in tears and mucus, his eyes swollen and the mark on his cheek already turning into a nasty purple bruise. He sobbed, his voice breaking into a piercing wail that echoed through the empty lobby, begging me not to do this and pleading with me not to leave him behind. He screamed that he had been played, claiming Chloe had lied to him and manipulated him, swearing he didn't know what he was doing. He swore to God he never wanted to hurt me, blaming everything on her for driving him crazy. He gripped my pants tightly, crying out that he was my son and begging me not to throw him away like trash. I looked down at him. I stared at the man who was clutching my leg like a drowning sailor, white-knuckling a piece of driftwood. For a split second, the lens of time shifted. I didn't see a 30-year-old corporate embezzler. I saw a toddler with scraped knees, crying for his dad to pick him up. I saw the 7-year-old boy who made me a Father's Day card out of macaroni and glue. I saw the child riding on my shoulders at the zoo, a little boy whose laughter alone used to be enough to make me feel completely whole. My heart contracted, sending a sharp, twisting pain straight through my chest. A primitive protective instinct, buried deep within my DNA, screamed at me to bend down, pull him up, and tell him I would fix everything. It urged me to tell him I'd write one last check to chase all the monsters away. The impulse was an absolute tidal wave, almost impossible to resist, but a secondary memory pierced through the warmth like a jagged shard of ice. I remembered the meeting in my office just 3 days ago. I remembered the pure, unadulterated contempt in his eyes when he believed I had been completely pushed out of power. I remembered the shock of his hand striking my face tonight, that violent blow when I tried to stop his reckless spending. I remembered the way his voice hissed over the phone, threatening to lock me away in a state asylum and sedate me into compliance just so he could spend my wealth without the inconvenience of my existence. Chloe wasn't in the office back then, and she certainly wasn't on the other end of that phone call. That was all him. That was the darkness that lived deep within his own soul. The memory of the little boy vanished, replaced entirely by the raw, ugly reality of the predator kneeling at my feet. He wasn't crying because he felt genuine remorse or guilt. He was crying simply because he lost. He was crying because the ATM that endlessly spit out cash had suddenly shut down, and this 30-year-old infant had absolutely no idea how to survive in a world without it. I took a step back, forcefully yanking my leg out of his desperate grip. He lost his balance, tumbling forward onto his hands as his shoulders shook violently from a fresh wave of sobbing. I looked down at him with a clarity that felt terrifying. The love was still there, buried deep underneath layers of heavy scar tissue, but the trust was entirely dead. And love without trust is nothing more than a hostage situation. I spoke up, keeping my voice low and completely devoid of warmth, telling him he hadn't been played by anyone. I didn't need to yell. The truth itself was loud enough to shatter the room. I told him he was a grown man who had made his own choices. I reminded him that he chose to sign those fraudulent wire transfers. He chose to mock me in front of his wealthy friends, and he chose to view my life's work as a personal piggy bank for his bottomless vanity. I told him Chloe didn't force him to become this, explaining that she had simply given him a convenient excuse to become the exact person he always wanted to be deep down inside. He lifted his head, opening his mouth to argue and spin another lie, but I cut him off ice cold. I told him he chose greed over family, locking my gaze onto his eyes. I told him that when he looked at his own father, he didn't see a human being, he saw an obstacle. I told him he saw a walking wallet and said his only real regret was that I wasn't dying fast enough to let him liquidate the estate. I reminded him that Chloe didn't do that. He did. I told him that was the true state of his soul. I took a deep breath, feeling the absolute finality of the moment sink into my bones. I told him I could forgive a mistake, a failed investment, or even total bankruptcy, but I made it clear that I would never raise vipers in my own home, and vowed that once they bit me, I would never let them crawl under my roof again. Julian stared up at me, the last trace of color draining from his face as the reality sank in that there was no safety net coming this time. There was no grand lecture, and there was no comforting hug afterward. There was only a hard, freezing abyss. I turned around. It was the hardest physical movement I had ever made in my entire life, feeling exactly as though my own chest was being violently torn open, but I forced myself to do it anyway. I turned my back on my son completely. Diane was waiting a few paces away. Her face looked a bit pale, and her eyes held a trace of emotion behind her glasses. But she gave me a firm nod. It was a silent gesture of support and respect, knowing full well the brutal price I had just paid. She extended her arm, and I took it, using her ironclad resolve to prop up my rapidly fading strength. We began walking toward the main exit. Behind me, I could hear the desperate, clumsy sounds of Julian scrambling onto his hands and knees, trying to chase after us. He cried out for me to wait, screaming that I couldn't do this. He didn't even make it 3 steps before the 2 massive men in dark suits blocked his path. They were my private security detail, a team I hired to protect me from outside threats, never imagining the greatest danger would come from my own flesh and blood. They didn't touch him because they didn't need to. They simply stood there like a wall of solid muscle and steel, a barrier he would never be able to cross. I kept my eyes locked onto the glowing red exit sign ahead, using it as a lighthouse to guide me out of that personal hell. I focused entirely on the rhythm of my shoes clicking against the marble floor. I forced myself to inhale and exhale, pushing air into lungs that felt tightly constricted and painful. Behind me, his frantic wails grew louder and more desperate. It wasn't the sound of a child crying anymore. It was the howling of a man realizing he was completely marooned. He shrieked for me not to leave him, crying out that he had nothing left. His voice cracked and broke, echoing off the high ceilings and bouncing between the empty tables covered in untouched luxury food. Tens of thousands of dollars worth of Wagyu steak and Boston lobster were slowly growing cold on silver platters. The champagne tower stood like a deserted ruin, The expensive wedding cake looked like a monument dedicated to absolute waste and greed, and sitting quietly on every single table were the unpaid invoices that the frantic vendors would soon be shoving directly into his hands. I pushed through the heavy double doors, stepping out into the dark California night. The crisp breeze hit my face, instantly drying the cold sweat on my forehead. The quiet of the parking lot was a massive relief compared to the noisy hell inside. I got into the waiting car, and Diane slid into the seat next to me. As the driver started the engine and pulled away, I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead. I didn't look back at the massive glass windows of the ballroom. I didn't want to see the silhouette of my son kneeling entirely alone in the middle of that empty wreckage, screaming at a father who was no longer listening. The low hum of the engine carried me away from my broken family, heading into an unknown and lonely future. But finally, I was free from the bleeding lies. The quiet clinking of forks against porcelain plates was the only sound inside the dimly lit bistro, tucked away in a quiet corner of an upscale San Francisco neighborhood. It was a total contrast to the deafening chaos that filled my life just 7 days ago. There were no screaming brides, no shattering chandeliers, and no son crying on the floor for a salvation he didn't deserve. There was only the low hum of the city moving along outside, completely indifferent to the personal apocalypse I had just carried out with my own hands. I sat across from Diane just like we had done hundreds of times over the last 20 years. But tonight, the air between us was entirely different. The tight tension of an impending war was gone, replaced by the quiet, aching exhaustion shared by survivors. We ate a simple meal of roasted chicken and green salads. The food tasted less like a luxury experience and more like fuel necessary to keep our vitals running. Diane set her fork down and took a sip of water. She skimmed a summary document on her tablet screen before sliding the device across the table toward me. She didn't need to say a word for me to know what it contained. It was the final damage assessment report, the ultimate bill for the collateral damage of that ruined wedding. It turns out federal law has a much lower tolerance for tantrums than I ever did. Chloe's parents, the two frauds who had spent months ordering my estate staff around and treating my generosity like an entitlement, were currently being processed at the Santa Clara County Jail. The police report was incredibly thorough. When the SWAT team forcibly evicted them from my Carmel estate, they chose to vent their rage by violently destroying my private property. They smashed crates of vintage wine that were older than their daughter and overturned priceless mid-century antique furniture in the living room. The total property damage exceeded $150,000. Now they were facing federal felony charges for grand larceny and malicious destruction of property. Despite the wealthy image they tried to project, they were completely broke. This legal battle would bankrupt them entirely, and the courts would force the liquidation of their only home just to pay for the vintage wine they poured onto the floor. It was a tiny, incredibly ugly end that perfectly matched their tiny, ugly ambitions. I looked at the mugshots flashing on the screen. Their faces were twisted into expressions of deep confusion and outrage. Even now, their brains, warped by the shallow vanity of the Silicon Valley social scene, couldn't grasp the most basic law of nature. Choices carry consequences. I didn't feel a single ounce of victory, only a dull, heavy sense of finality. They played a game they couldn't afford, and they lost absolutely everything. And then there was Julian. I pushed the tablet back to Diane and turned my head to look out the window at the traffic racing by. I didn't need a formal report to know where my son was. My private investigator had already sent the photos to my phone this morning. The images were a bit grainy, shot from a distance through a long telephoto lens, but they were clear enough to rip a father's heart open all over again. Julian was working. For the first time in his 30 years on this earth, he was doing actual, physical labor. He had managed to find a gig working a greasy, short-order shift at a run-down 24-hour diner on the absolute edge of San Jose. It was a place that smelled permanently of cheap fry oil and pure despair, the kind of dump he wouldn't have even glanced at a week ago. He was a busboy. In the photos, he was wearing an apron covered in mysterious stains, struggling to carry a heavy plastic bin piled high with dirty dishes. Sweat was pouring down his forehead, and his eyes looked completely vacant, filled with the sheer exhaustion of a person being thoroughly crushed by life. He was living in a sketchy extended stay motel nearby, sharing a room that had zero air conditioning with three undocumented immigrants, sleeping on a saggy twin mattress on a set of bunk beds. He was grinding through two back-to-back, grueling manual shifts every single day just to make payments on a mountain of high-interest debt that now belonged strictly to him. The image of him standing there kept flashing in my mind. His feet, which had only ever stepped on luxury Persian rugs, were now crammed into cheap canvas sneakers, throbbing and aching from 12 hours on a hard floor. I envisioned him getting yelled at by a rough truck driver because he brought out a cup of lukewarm coffee, getting bossed around by a diner manager who didn't even graduate high school and couldn't care less that his last name was Sterling. I could feel the sheer physical shock of it. It was the brutal reality of labor, the violent collision between flesh and the real world. It was that ultimate humiliation that comes when you finally realize the world doesn't care if you're tired, and it certainly doesn't care if you're sad. From the infinity pool at the Carmel estate to a commercial dishwashing sink, from a Porsche 911 to a night bus packed with the homeless, it was a devastating fall. I took a slow sip of my wine, letting the bitterness linger on my tongue. A deep, heavy sadness, a hollow ache right in the center of my chest, where my pride used to live, tightened its grip on me. Watching your own child suffer is a terrible thing. It goes against every basic biological instinct a parent has. But sitting right next to that shadow of grief was something else. A sense of lightness. A feeling that my lungs finally had the space to breathe again. For years, Julian had been a malignant tumor in my life. A cancer built entirely out of entitlement and greed. He had been slowly killing me from the inside out, draining my resources and poisoning whatever small drops of happiness I had left. Now I had finally cut it out. The surgery was incredibly bloody, and the incision was still raw and throbbing, but the sickness was gone. I was no longer a hostage in my own home. I no longer had to live in fear of my own flesh and blood. Diane cleared her throat, breaking the heavy silence and bringing me back to the room. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick document. It was bound in a simple, unadorned blue cover. She placed it on the table between us, setting it down right next to the salt and pepper shakers. This was the final piece of business, the ultimate line of defense to lock away the past forever. She told me softly that it was the setup paperwork for the new foundation, explaining that the entire structure had been built exactly to my specifications. She confirmed that the liquid assets and corporate equity from the trust had been successfully transferred, and the initial board of directors had been vetted. She said all it needed now was my final signature. I looked down at the document. The title was printed in a bold, heavy black font, the Clara Sterling Foundation for Advanced Science and Education. Clara, my beautiful late wife. In a perfect world, Julian was supposed to be the continuation of her life. He was supposed to carry her kindness, her intellect, and her name into the future. But he chose a completely different path, a straight line down to the abyss. So now her legacy would live on through this instead. I picked up my Mont Blanc pen. The money funding this foundation was the exact capital that had been set aside for Julian's inheritance. That multi-million-dollar trust, the massive safety net I spent half my life weaving to catch him whenever he fell, was now going to be used to catch complete strangers. The foundation was designed to provide full rides and research grants to brilliant underprivileged STEM students. Kids who came from the same dirt-poor background I did, young people who had absolutely nothing to their names except grit and a dream. Kids who actually understood the precise weight of a dollar bill because they had to sweat for every single one of them. I pulled the cap off the pen without a single second of hesitation. I slid my name across the signature line, the black ink bleeding into the paper, making it an unchangeable legal reality. With that single signature, I officially shifted the weight of the Sterling family legacy away from my cursed bloodline, and anchored it directly to my values. I chose to bet the future on a generation of strangers who shared my drive, rather than a parasitic son who just happened to share my DNA. I passed the folder back to Diane. I told her it was done. She gave a small nod, slipping the paperwork back into her bag with a level of respect that actually touched me. She told me I was doing an incredible thing, adding that Clara would be immensely proud of me. I smiled. It was the first genuine, real smile to cross my face in an entire week, and the movement felt almost foreign on my stiff jaw. I told her softly that I certainly hoped so. I turned my eyes back to the window. The San Francisco skyline opened up before me, a massive, sweeping canvas of neon lights, rolling fog, and deep shadows. At 68 years old, most men are looking backward, counting down their remaining days and preparing for the end of things. But sitting here in this quiet bistro, stripped of my family and cured of my illusions, I didn't feel an ending at all. I felt a beginning. The suffocating weight of expectation was gone. The heavy chains of carrying a grown infant had been broken. The constant nagging fear of being used and plotted against had completely vanished. I was entirely alone, yes, but I was absolutely free. Woe had my health, I still held absolute command over my empire, and I had taken back my dignity. And now I had a brand new mission. I had thousands of kids I had never met, whose lives were about to change forever, all because I finally found the courage to look at my only son and say no. I caught the waiter's eye and gestured for the check. I was ready to go home, not to a massive, quiet mansion filled with tension, hypocrisy, and a pack of greedy heirs waiting for me to die, but to a peaceful sanctuary where the only thing breaking the quiet would be the music I chose to play. As Diane and I stepped out of the bistro together, walking into the chilly Pacific breeze cutting off the water, the noise of the city wrapped around me again, vibrant and full of life. I buttoned up my heavy coat, feeling the cold air hit my face, but it only made me feel more solid, more unbreakable. My stride felt lighter than it had in a decade. Sometimes, to give your children the single most important lesson of their lives, you have to sit back and watch them lose absolutely everything. You have to let them drop straight to the bottom and hit the hard earth, so they can finally figure out what their own bones are made of. You have to stop playing the savior, so they can finally learn how to pull themselves out of the mud. And sometimes, to find yourself again, to take back the life you spent every waking hour building from scratch, you have to be brutal enough and brave enough to let go of the hands of the people you love the most, especially when you realize they are the exact ones trying to drag you under and drown you in the deep water. I let go of his hand, and for the first time in a very long time, I could finally take a full, deep breath of air.